Good afternoon. Welcome to our second live streaming from COP30 in Belém in Brazil. I'm Lee Morris. I'm Director of International for the Wildlife Trust. I'm in the UK, but we are going to be joined again today by Bethan Lachlan, Senior Policy Specialist from the Zoological Society of London, ZSL. Bethan is out in COP, and after we spoke to her on day one of week one, just over a week ago, I'm very much looking forward to getting her reflections on week one at COP30. Bethan, hi, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello again.
Yeah, it's great to see you. So we're going to keep this one, it's a lunchtime one today. So my first question to you is give us some highlights, or your highlight from week one. And I believe there's been a vote involved with some UK MPs.
It has. Greetings from day two of week two at COP30. Week one was something of a whirlwind, they often are. But you asked about highlights. I think one of the key ones is just that things really are in full swing here. We've seen the advancement of the technical negotiations that have been going on, hundreds of incredible side events, amazing participation from Indigenous peoples, local communities, and also just a real melting pot of people. And talking of people, last week I had the really wonderful opportunity to brief a number of UK parliamentarians, members of parliament who were here in Belém, and we had the opportunity to brief them, but it wasn't a normal briefing. We were on a boat going down the Amazon for a few hours. There's a little clip of it here. It was really quite beautiful, and an opportunity to talk to our members of parliament about not only the need to champion multinationalism in the UK, but also a reminder of everything we're trying to save, and what the whole point of this negotiation is. So it was a really wonderful day.
How was the conversation? How was the conversation on the boat? What's your sense from our parliamentarians in Belém?
Yeah, it was a really positive conversation, but it's also really clear that we have to do a much better job of communicating about why this work matters to the UK context, because obviously their priority is on how do we communicate this to local constituents. And so a lot of our time was spent talking about the negotiation priorities, the political priorities, the big ticket items that we're seeing here, but also how do we effectively communicate that on the ground. We were also joined on the boat by an amazing NGO called the Environmental Justice Foundation, who did a briefing on the importance of environmental defenders in Brazil, and how they are actively trying to protect and enhance their local biodiversity. So we sort of did a bit of a tag team, me focusing on the negotiations and then focusing on the sort of wider justice elements of this COP. The MPs were super engaged. It was a mixture of parties. There was Labour, Lib Dem, Conservative. But to me, it really struck home that we have to really be always thinking about what's the communicatable impact back home. So it was really interesting. I think I learned a lot. I hope they did too. And the setting really helped us sort of see the significance of moving from understanding how these really technical negotiations really matter practically.
Wonderful. That sounds like you've been a great nudge on some of them. So before I ask my next question, if anyone watching, and thanks to those of you who are joining today, probably in your lunch breaks, if you do have a question for Bethan, we've probably got time for one or two in the chat. So please pop a question in the chat for Bethan if you've got one, please. While they're coming in, Bethan, we talked last week about this being the nature COP or the forest COP. And I'm aware from the UK that there's been a bit of discussion around bringing together the different Rio conventions. Could you give us a flavour of that and how much nature is focused in the last week?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's a funny one, right? Because this is the nature COP. It's being labelled as such, but nature isn't really very present in a lot of the negotiations. So that's something that ZSL and the Wildlife Trust and others have been trying to remedy for a number of years. And one of those opportunities is in a negotiation item called cooperation between international organizations. And this is the first time this agenda item has happened at a COP. it usually happens at the smaller middle of the year meetings that happen in June in Bonn. So having it happen at COP is really significant. And what we saw last week was, after a little bit of quite worrying deadlock for a couple of days, we saw that actually the presidency, the Brazilian presidency, has taken this agenda item as one of their main priorities, and they're pushing it into week 2. So this gets a little bit technical, but the presidency is able to sort of take up and champion a number of key areas, and they've decided this item on cooperation is one that they want to do. And the reason it's so significant is that, as many people will know, we have all these different conventions that cover climate, that cover land, that cover nature, but they don't particularly effectively communicate with each other. They're very siloed and not linked up. And this agenda item, if we can succeed in landing some text, would be a real opportunity for these conventions to come together when it comes to implementation, which is really, really significant, because all three of these conventions, climate, land, and nature, are meant to be in their implementation stage at the moment. But to do that, they have to be working together. They're not. So this is an opportunity to try and fix that. And I'm very pleased to say that although there's a huge amount still to do, and it could all fall through, we're feeling quite positive that week 1 ended on a really good note. And we're going to see, as of today at 5 p.m. my time today, we're moving into textual negotiations. So parties are going to be discussing the text that they want to conclude. One other thing that I'll add is the other thing that's been very, very pressing here on the nature side is around the Tropical Forest Forever facility, which is a new financial model that's been launched. It was launched at week 1. The idea behind the TFFF is that it's a new model to incentivize deforestation prevention through investments. So it's an investment model, and then you get payments back for deforestation prevention.
And Bethan, sorry to interrupt, but it's in the news here that the UK is not paying into the TFFF.
Yeah.
What's the sense on that?
It's true, it isn't as of yet. We've heard that we so far as we know, the UK is not investing, and that's very much linked to the fact that we've got a budget coming up very, very soon. However, it is, I think, quite fair to say that the Brazilians are incredibly disappointed about this, and that's putting it quite mildly. The UK was one of the big minds behind the creation of the TFFF. There's a lot of UK brains in its design. So the fact that the UK isn't contributing is a real shame. However, it's not the end of it. There is the next step is that we're hopeful, and the UK have given hints that after the budget there will be an opportunity to invest. So we do have to keep up that pressure, so that the UK do feel that this is a really important thing for them to do. So on behalf of society, we're doing that.
So just for the people in the UK, there's all these acronyms running around about COPs and TFFs, etc.
Yeah.
So let's just a little bit more on the TFFF. As I understand this, this is about countries, party states who can afford to pay money into a fund that will then go to countries with tropical forests to pay them not to cut it down. In simple terms, is that's correct? Yes.
Yeah, that's the idea. It's what's known as an outcome-based bond. So you put money into it, and then if the outcomes are positive, aka we're not seeing deforestation, you get an investment back, so a bit like a dividend. But the idea behind the TFFF is that you need some public money to kickstart it. So you need countries to give money, but then once that's happened, the hope is, and the aim is, that private investment will follow. So the vast majority of the money will actually come from the private markets. But to do that, those markets need to feel that this is a trusted model and need to feel that it's a safe model. So that's why UK and other country investment is really important, to sort of start that snowball effect of more and more money being pumped into deforestation prevention.
Thank you. So I'm going to change the subject now. So another thing that very much hit the headlines from COP30 in the last week was around the protesters, the indigenous people, and there was one day where some of them forced their way into an area that was off limits. So, and we also see lots of protests outside and around the COP building. What's the vibe there from Belém in terms of indigenous people, and how much of an impact were those protesters on you personally? Did that impact you, or describe what it's like there in terms of the indigenous people?
Yeah, so this COP has got more indigenous people who are accredited, so has to have badges like me, than any other COP in history. There are we think around 5,000 indigenous people who are accredited with badges. However, these protests are a signal that there's a huge, long way to go. Accreditation is complicated. You need to have an organization to sort of be like, I'm accredited by the Zoological Society of London. So it's a pretty formalized process, and a lot of these indigenous people might not have access to that level of sort of formalized engagement. So these protests were a real symbol of, although we've come quite a long way, there's a huge amount left to do for indigenous peoples and local communities to feel supported and part of and listened to by this protest. The protests themselves were surprising, but not unwelcome. There was a little bit of violence, as you might have seen in some of the videos, but most of the protests that we've seen, the vast majority, has been peaceful and actually somewhat beautiful. We've seen indigenous people lining the entrance to the COP, just sort of presenting themselves as a vital part of this conversation. And we know that conservation and climate work is more effective, far, far more effective, when indigenous people are part of it. And we also know that they are the caretakers of the vast majority of our biodiversity. There was also another protest that took place on Saturday, which was led by civil society. Indigenous people were also there, but it was a civil society protest, and this was one that lined the streets of Belém, thousands of people marching. And the reason this is significant is because for the last 3 COPs, we haven't been able to do protests like that. There's only been, the last one, there was a big one, was in Glasgow for COP26. But since then, we've had COPs in Sharm el Sheikh, in Dubai, and also in Baku, all of which countries where protest is often illegal or very heavily discouraged. So any type of big civil society engagement was not possible. So the fact that we could have this vibrant, beautiful protest on Saturday is really positive, and it felt really lovely actually to see all of civil society come together. I only saw a snippet of it, but it was a real pleasure.
Do you know, from the little snippets I've watched on the news, it looked to me not angry, aggressive people. It looked about caring, passionate people who just loved their places of nature and wanted to be respected, and were just trying to almost implore people to listen to them. So it did come across in a positive way on the bits I saw. So I'm going to manage.
I haven't seen any coverage of it because we're like in the middle of it, but it has felt that way. Yeah, it hasn't felt aggressive or dangerous. It's felt encouraging and full of hope, actually.
Right, I'm going to wrap us up on a lunchtime shortly, Bethan. But before we go, we'll come back to that hope word again. What are you hoping for in the coming week at COP30?
Yeah, so this is the week where the rubber really does hit the road. The ministers have arrived. So for the UK, it's Ed Miliband and other ministers. And what we're seeing is a move away from the very technical negotiations into the political. So a lot of texts are being given to ministers to negotiate. And that means it becomes a little bit harder to track from an observer point of view, because a lot of the rooms we can't access. However, it's also very positive because it shows progress. What we're seeing in the next week is a couple of really big ticket items that are coming out. So for ZSL, one of our main ones is what I just spoke about around the cooperation item. So we have seen the text, and the text negotiations will start later today. So that will be a real I can tell you next when we next speak sort of how that progresses. There's also a lot going on adaptation, and adaptation is actually kind of becoming the most contentious item, or one of the most contentious items of this COP. And that's all about adaptation finance. So how do we support global south countries to adapt and build resilience against climate shocks? But then on top of that, there's also, this is very emerging and we don't have the details yet, but there's also news that the presidency, the Brazilian presidency, are possibly putting forward what they're calling roadmaps. So this will be a document, we're not sure of the content yet, but documents that create a roadmap for the phase out of fossil fuels and a roadmap to combat deforestation. And on the fossil fuel ones, that's significant because in the UNFCCC, we have never been able to say in any texts that we should phase out fossil fuels. The strongest it's ever got is phase down. So although it's one word, it's very significant. And then also a deforestation roadmap has never been done before in its own unique way. So these two roadmaps, there's a lot of buzz around them, a lot of political attention. But this is very much in the presidency's hands around how they guide this through and how they build diplomatic support from countries. So I say it's those four things, those two roadmaps, it's adaptation, and its progress on synergies is what I'm looking forward to in the next week.
Fantastic. And I'm conscious of, again, there'll be people hopefully going to be watching this or catching up later that don't understand how COPs work, but it's consensus, isn't it? Yeah. So it's baby steps that everyone must agree to. Anything too radical and people will object and therefore it doesn't progress, correct?
Yeah, absolutely correct. It's what's known as a consensus-based process. So if one country says they're not happy, it does not happen. So that's often why we see a reduction in ambition, ideal levels of ambition, because you have to try and find that middle ground. The saying goes that consensus is king in this space, and it's a funny one because I think people assume that it's a voting-based process, and sadly, it really isn't. So they often say that you have to make sure that everybody is equally dissatisfied at the end, and then you know that there's been a diplomatic success. Which is often quite depressing, but also an important reminder of how this kind of multilateral diplomacy actually works.
Brilliant. I've not seen any questions pop in the chat, and we were planning to keep this a little bit shorter today because of lunchtime. So I think unless there's any last final thoughts or comments, Bethan, I'll let you get back to COP30 in Brazil.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main thing, main reflection, is that it's really interesting to see this process really be sort of straining we do it under it weight around how do because that is the crux of it, right? So you've got all these negotiations, you've got vital stuff on how do we have just levels of finance for adaptation, how do we protect the world's most vulnerable, simultaneously with how do we actually phase out fossil fuels on a global level, simultaneously with how do we fix these systems so they actually operate for implementation. So all of these things are all muddled together. There are literally dozens of negotiation streams that are happening. 40 decisions were ticked off last week, but there are still another 40 to be finished this week. The scale of it is just amazing.
We've had one question, Bethan, from Paul, who's asked, how do we, these consensual promises, how does the world make them how do we make them enforceable so that those things happen? How does that work?
Yeah, so this is a voluntary-based process that is part of the UNFCCC. But the point is that it doesn't end when the COP finishes, right? The point is that you go home and you implement. So that's why things like nationally determined contributions, which is the UK, the plans that every country has to make to decarbonize, that they're called NDCs, nationally determined contributions. So that's why they're so important that those have teeth, right? That they work. So the accountability, yes, it happens here, but most importantly, it happens at home. Because if a country makes commitments, if the UK makes commitments on the multilateral stage and then doesn't deliver, that is a betrayal of promises made to the international community. So as civil society, academic organizations, as public-facing organizations, that accountability stuff is super, super important. And as ZSL, the work on COP definitely doesn't end when the COP finishes. The work on accountability starts the moment we land back home. And I know that we're not alone in that. Many other organizations are the same, including the Wildlife Trust. So it's a tricky one, but it is definitely possible. The thing I always try to remind myself of is that, like, it was the Paris Agreement that inspired the UK to be the first country in the world to have a net zero target. And now 80% of countries have a net zero target. And I think it's around 90% or 80 to 90% of global GDP is covered under a net zero target. So these processes really do matter, but they're a signal, not a hammer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And we had one of the comments, Jane. I'm going to agree with you. I think a world roadmap sounds a absolutely needed thing. And I'm also sensing, Bethan, that it matters. The relevance of this to the UK is still there, and we need, and every one of us in the UK that's listening to this can make a small difference. It contributes.
Absolutely, that thing on accountability, like when I think back to the conversations I was having with the MPs earlier, many of them were saying that from their point of view, climate and nature is dropping down the priority list for their constituents because of the cost of living crisis and how difficult it is for many people at the moment. So I think, I personally, I'm not sure that is necessarily true. Like the global polling shows that 83% of people globally want more action on climate and nature. But it is definitely true that we have a really big role to play to remind our elected officials that this matters, and that especially the younger generations, our children and folks who are younger, absolutely paramount for them and things that they really care about. And the MPs really pick up on that, but obviously those kids can't vote. So how do we represent those interests when we go to the polling booth, and that when we engage with our elected officials in whatever way we choose to do so?
Brilliant. They'll vote one day anyway. I'm going to manage time and thank you. I don't see any more questions. Thank you to those of you that have joined us today at lunchtime. Thank you to those of you that may be watching this later. There will be a third one after COP where we catch up with Bethan with one of the climate change experts as well from within the Wildlife Trust joining on the call as well. So Bethan, thank you very much for joining us again today from Belém. You're 3 hours behind us, so enjoy your day ahead.
I will. Thank you so much. It's a busy day, so I'll catch you when COP has concluded.
Yeah, I look forward to our third link up after COP. Many thanks. Thanks to all of you for joining. Bye.